It is a year ago today that Israel suffered one of the deadliest terror attacks ever recorded on the planet and the worst massacre of Jewish people since the Second World War. The murder by Hamas terrorists of over 1,200 Israelis has prompted widespread violence and unrest across the whole region, with conflict between Israel and Hamas spilling out into other parts of the Middle East. LBC's Henry Riley looks back at the events of a year ago today and the consequences which have reverberated around the world ever since.
We have breaking news out of Israel this morning where Hamas has launched a surprise attack.
Le Hamas vient de lancer une attaque.
Terrororganisation Hamas.
The 7th of October 2023, the deadliest day for Jewish people since the Holocaust. 4,300 rockets launched against Israel, starting in the early hours of the morning as Hamas militants crossed the Israel-Gaza barrier. One sudden attack was at the Supernova Open Air Music Festival, killing 364 people. In total, more than 1,200 people, mostly civilians, died that day, and around 250 hostages abducted by Hamas, including Noah Argamani.
I asked to see the video, and then I saw that it was definitely her. She was so scared, so frightened. I always protected her, and at this very moment, I couldn't.
Israel's response was of fire and fury, deadly and continuous bombing in Gaza. We saw strong words from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
Israel is at war. Hamas will understand that by attacking us, they've made a mistake of historic proportions. We will exact a price that will be remembered by them for decades to come.
And actions from Defence Minister Yoav Gallant.
We are imposing a complete siege on Gaza. There will be no electricity, no food, no water, no fuel.
But the country enjoyed international support.
Israel has the right to defend itself and its people. Full stop.
In November, a short ceasefire was agreed in exchange for hundreds of Palestinian prisoners being released by Israel. Over 100 hostages were brought home. But the truce ended, the bombing restarted, and has barely stopped since. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza estimates over 41,000 people have been killed. The UN and several international leaders have condemned Israel's response and its proportionality, with allies also changing their language.
We should have a ceasefire now.
The number one priority is to ensure we get a ceasefire.
1 year on, the conflict is far from over and is intensifying, with Israel targeting the Iran-backed Hezbollah and the Houthis. We've seen a recent ground offensive by Israel in southern Lebanon, and Iran fired 200 missiles at Israel last week, with air raid sirens ringing out across Tel Aviv. And despite talk of de-escalation, tens of thousands dead and 97 hostages still held, the rhetoric from world leaders shows that they are not in listening mode. From Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei.
Our enemy is one. Al-Aqsa flood by Gaza, which took place a year ago. It was a lawful act of resistance.
To Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
There is nowhere in the Middle East Israel cannot reach. There's nowhere we will not go to protect our people and protect our country.
That was Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking last week to conclude Henry Riley's report. The latest developments overnight are that Hamas has fired several rockets at Israel this morning, most of them intercepted, while the IDF has launched operations throughout Gaza focused on damaging Hamas tunnels and rocket launchers. Meanwhile, in Beirut, the Israeli bombardment of the Lebanese capital has continued. Let's go now to Matt Frei, who, of course, is my LBC colleague. He's also Channel 4 news presenter, and he's presenting a new special from Jerusalem tonight to mark the one-year anniversary. Matt Frei joins me now. Matt, you have been to that region probably more times than you can remember. What strikes you most about the mood today, the sense of today? Morning, Matt.
Yeah, good morning, Nick. I mean, I've just come back from a march that was organised before dawn by the families of the hostages, either those still held or indeed those killed. And it was a march towards the Prime Minister's Jerusalem residence, which is heavily protected by police. And what really struck me was the sullen silence of that march, which then, at 6:29 was interrupted as the siren sounded for the exact 1 year mark for when this horror began. And the posters of the hostages are very familiar to anyone who's been to Israel. They're literally on every street corner, on every other building. Their names are familiar, their faces are familiar, their eyes are familiar, the way they, these pictures were taken in happier times, of course, but those eyes stare out with reproach at the government saying, what are you doing to release us? They stare out at reproach to Israeli society. Do you still care for us? And at reproach to the rest of the world. Like, do you actually care about us at all? Because what the families of the hostages are saying is that there's so much emphasis on the suffering in Gaza and in southern Lebanon at the moment, and what might happen with the ballistic ping pong between Iran and Israel, that no one cares about us anymore. And then every single one of these posters has the number of the original age crossed out and written next to it, the new age 1 year on. Now, I think it's worth remembering, Nick, that everyone here who's been affected by this war suffers individually, in their own bubble of misery. If you're in Palestine, if you're in Gaza, if you're in the West Bank, it's a similar story. But it's more difficult to access those particular tales of misery because we can't get there, especially not to Gaza. Yeah. If you're in southern Lebanon, you have a similar story to tell. If you're hiding in a shelter in Iran, you might be, afraid of an Israeli missile coming overhead, and vice versa. I mean, yesterday, Iran cancelled all air traffic into Iran because they were convinced the Israelis were going to fire the next salvo of missile against Iranian targets, whether oil fields or nuclear military, we don't know. And of course, everyone here in Israel fully expects that the skies will fill with ballistic missiles from Iran as soon as Israel does something. So we're actually in the most dangerous moment that we've been in this crisis 1 year on. It should be a moment for reflection. It should be a moment for some kind of perspective. But actually, it has never been as dangerous for the region as it is now.
Matt, obviously a nation united in grief and horror and shock, but how united politically? How much support for Netanyahu?
Not united. In fact, even the hostage families aren't united. There are rival camps. Some hostage families are furious with the government. They are telling us that the Prime Minister is more interested in killing Palestinians. I mean, not just Hamas officials, but innocent Palestinians, and in freeing the hostages. Then there are others who feel that the Prime Minister is doing the right thing, that the only way to get their relatives freed is to put military pressure on Hamas. And of course, those divisions are then magnified in Israeli society, where the Prime Minister has gained a little bit of support by taking on Hezbollah and killing Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, recently. But there are many, many, many Israelis who hate Prime Minister Netanyahu with such a vengeance, such a passion. I've never seen anything like this before.
Some of Netanyahu's behaviour, how stretched are relations with the US, the key ally, and other allies, Matt?
Well, here's an extraordinary piece of tape that came out a day ago. President Macron of France, who's been a fairly staunch ally of Prime Minister Netanyahu, despite the occasional criticism of overstepping the mark in Gaza, said a few days ago, we should stop arms sales to Israel. Netanyahu gets on telly, literally hours later in English, so it was meant for a global audience, and he said this was disgraceful, I quote. It was shameful, I quote again. This is not what allies of Israel do. We are vulnerable. We're surrounded by all these enemies. We're fighting a war on 7 different fronts, and we are fighting, Netanyahu says, a war for Western values, for Western civilization, and you're hanging us out to dry. Except the problem, of course, is that if you're fighting a war for Western values, those are not the values that are coming at the end of an Israeli missile or airstrike into a Gaza apartment block or into an apartment block in Lebanon. And I think that is the key question, really, the key conundrum behind all this, Nick. Yes, Israel has the right to defend itself. And yes, you could argue that it should do so with Western weapons. But at what price? At what, I hate the word, collateral damage to innocent civilians? And I think there Israel has very different calculations to the rest of us.
Matt, thanks so much for that. Matt Frei is, of course, one of my LBC colleagues, Saturday morning from 10, but he's hosting a Channel 4 news special from Jerusalem tonight to mark 1 year anniversary. Appreciate that, Matt, because you're a busy man this morning. Well, now over to you. How has your attitude perhaps changed over these last 12 months? More than 1,200 Israelis killed, probably more than 40,000, mostly Palestinians killed, of course, in the retaliatory attacks. The death toll is extraordinary. And I'll give you more detail on this. Here in the UK, a study finds 1 in 10 young Britons have a favourable view of Hamas. Now, I know activities on both sides have been pretty horrific, but I won't necessarily list some of the atrocities that were committed by Hamas a year ago, but you know them, involving soldiers, how they were treated, and children. How can anyone have support for that?